Okay, do you have a right arm? Do you have a left arm?
Yes.
Match up pretty well, don't they?
Yes.
You have a right leg?
Yes.
You have a left leg?
Yes.
Match up pretty well, don't they?
Yes.
Good. So that being said, if you know one side of the skull, you know the other side of the skull. Okay? So when we look at the skull, okay, we're basically going to divide it in half. Now the first thing we always want to look for is the nasal bone, because the nasal bone is always going to tell us where anterior is. So once we identify where the nasal bone is, we know that this is anterior and this therefore is what? Posterior. Okay? So there's anterior and posterior. Now the reason I asked you about whether you have left arm and right arm and they match up the same is because we only have to worry about memorizing one half of the skull, because if we know one half, we obviously know the other half, which makes life easier, doesn't it? Now what do we call that very large hole in the posterior part of the skull? Good, foramen magnum. Good, foramen magnum. Okay, so there's the foramen magnum. Okay? Now that's generally something that's easy to remember. Most people have a tendency to remember that for the exam, so I don't really have any mnemonic or trick for it because I think magnum means large, foramen is whole. Okay, pretty easy. But the skull is actually divided into three different sections. Okay? You have something called the anterior cranial fossa, the middle cranial fossa, and the posterior cranial fossa. Now what did that word fossa mean again? Depression. Good, depression. Okay, so fossa meant depression. So we have this area right here, which is the anterior cranial fossa. We have this right here, which is the middle cranial fossa, and this right here, which is the what? Posterior cranial fossa. Aren't they all depressions?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, and the brain sits in there. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is identify the first bone that we see in the anterior cranial fossa, and that's that right there. Okay, so that right there is going to be the anterior cranial fossa. Okay, in the anterior cranial fossa is going to be this bone right here. And the name of that bone right there is called the ethmoid bone. Now remember, didn't we say before, or earlier, that every time we see a suture, it means we're dealing with a different bone. So therefore, isn't this a different bone than this over here?
Yes.
Okay, so this bone we see in here is called the ethmoid bone. What's it called?
Ethmoid.
Good. What's it called?
Ethmoid.
Very good. It's the ethmoid bone. Now we see the ethmoid bone from here. We also see it from the nasal cavity, but we'll get to that later. So this right here again is called the ethmoid bone. What's it called? Ethmoid bone. Very good. Now there are certain parts in the bone. Okay, so if I put a label here and I say identify the bone, the answer has to be ethmoid bone. But if I ask you what is the name of that elevation, okay, we'll get to that in a second. Now remember we talked about this? And I said that, what was the name of this? Do you remember? Iliac crest. Close. Iliac crest. Okay. So remember I said crest is an elevation. Okay. Like the top of a mountain, like the crest of a mountain. So the top of this elevation we see right here, is called the crista galli. Crista is Latin for the word crest. So this elevation right here is called the crista galli. That's called the crista galli. So what is this elevation called? Crista galli. What's it called?
Crista galli.
Very good. Now, there's a depression on either side of the crista galli. Now, where does a baby sleep? What's the depression that a baby sleeps in? A crib. Excellent. So this depression on either side of the crista galli is called the cribiform plate. What's it called? Good. So the crista galli sleeps in the cribiform plate. So if I say identify the depression, your answer is what? Cribiform plate. If I say identify the elevation, the answer is what? Crista galli. So what's the elevation? What's the elevation? What's the depression? Cribiform plate. So say cribiform plate. Cribiform plate. So what's the depression called? Good. Where's the crista galli sleep? Oh, come on, louder. What's this called? What's it called? Very good. What's this called? Crista galli. What's it called? Good. And what bone is it? Ethmoid bone. Everybody agree with that? Okay, good. Now this hole right here, as I put the stick right through here, it comes through the orbit. And the place where the eye is located is called the orbit. So where is the eye located? In the what? Orbit. Okay, and it's actually a series of a few different bones, which we'll get into. But right now we just say the collection of the bones where the eye sits is called the orbit. What's it called?
Orbit.
Very good. Now, the name of this hole, though, is called the optic canal. So there's the optic canal. Does everybody see that? There's the optic canal. So say optic,
Optic.
canal.
Canal.
Optic,
Optic.
so canal.
Canal.
Good. Is this called the optic canal?
Yes.
Are you sure?
Yes.
Are you positive?
Yes.
Are you going to tell your Aunt Sally this is called the optic canal?
Yes.
Good. What's this called?
Optic canal.
Good. What's it called?
Optic.
Good. And what do we call this elevation? Crista galli. What do we call the depression on either side of the crista galli? Cribiform plate. What do we call the depression on either side of the crista galli?
Cribiform plate.
What's the elevation? Crista galli. Okay, good. Now, okay, we're going to now go into the middle cranial fossa. Okay, this is, we can consider the first section. This is the second section. This we're going to consider the third section. Obviously, you have to know it as anterior, middle, and posterior cranial fossa. Okay, but here, do you guys see these holes that are directly anterior to posterior in this direction? Now you agree that these holes are directly anterior to posterior in this direction, right? And then you see how there's this little one, or this larger one right here. Everybody see that? So everybody agrees that this